So, good morning, everyone. I'm glad that still a few of you decided to come to the early talk. So, I welcome you to my talk why bad code quality is not only your fault. First of all, you probably already know from yesterday, you can ask questions on Slido. I also put the link here, but otherwise you can also just go to slido.com and make sure to put in GeeCON. And important, choose room 11 so I see your questions and not to confuse other speakers. And also maybe you also could upvote questions. Yeah, if some are very interesting. So about me, I'm Annelore. I have a bachelor in computer science and about 8 years of programming experience. And I'm a software engineer at Open Value Switzerland since May 2024. So Open Value is a Java consultancy company in a few locations in Europe. Do you sometimes wonder why some of the code you see in your day-to-day life has a low code quality, but you cannot really put a finger on why? Today I want to analyze some potential aspects that could be the reason for that. But first of all, a little disclaimer. I know in the title it says fault, but I want to make sure that it is clear to everyone that blaming people is not a good idea. In general, I don't believe it's ever very productive to blame people. Instead, I just want to analyze analyze situations and identify underlying issues to find potential solutions. To set the stage, I quickly want to define code quality in this context. So in this context, code quality means code that is easy to understand, easy to change, and less likely to break unexpectedly. So I had the idea for this talk after I was approached by a business analyst from a previous project I was working on. He had found some business rules where he realized that they were unnecessarily complicated. So actually we were in a preparation of another feature and we wanted to rework a rule set because we knew that it had historically grown and there was a lot of duplication. And then the business analyst discovered some more business logic that could be simplified. Because there was an earlier story where some of the logic was already simplified, but there were some rules that had become obsolete and we had never realized. And also the whole business logic was very complex, so there were quite a few edge cases that always led to bugs. So I cannot show you the exact example, so I created another example that should still show the underlying issues. So in this scenario, we have a few couriers that deliver packages along a specified route. So this arrow is like the route. And the boss would want to follow where the couriers are in a web application. And the couriers, they can see where their colleagues are on a web application, on a mobile application. And the view on the web and the mobile is slightly different, especially the mobile application. You can, for example, see how far away your colleagues are and so. So now also some circles will appear and they will represent some updates that will be sent to the central system. These updates could, for example, contain a location or the number of packages remaining. So every time when the courier leaves or stops, an update is sent to the central system. There are only two kinds of events: stopping and leaving. So with leaving, I mean when the courier leaves after he delivered the package, or also when he leaves in the morning to start his route. And with stopping, I also mean when the courier stops at the house to deliver a package, or also when the courier arrives at the warehouse. But this also leads to many unnecessary updates, because often there isn't a lot that is changing from the time you stop at the house and you leave again. And actually, the idea was, the reason why we did it this way was only because at the beginning there's only a leaving event, and at the end there's only a stopping event. So a few years ago they just decided, it's easier when we make sure that there are always two events. But then during this update they decided, we could maybe change it, and then they changed it that usually that there's only an update when there's a leaving event, and only if there's no leaving event, then there's like an exceptional case that there will be an update at the stopping event. So therefore, these two updates could be eliminated because they were no longer necessary. And simplifying this was actually one of the core tasks of this story. And this is really good because a lot of these rules were duplicated. A lot of these rules were almost the same, but they were defined in two different classes that were almost identical. So you can imagine that there also were a lot of bugs because sometimes it was duplicated, but then they deviated and so on. Then there's also the house that is crossed out, and this means that there's no package that the deliverer has to be delivered. So there was still an update sent just with the same data as before, and actually this was totally unnecessary, and we also were able to remove it. So the original example is far more complex, but I hope I was able to get my point across, that the complex business logic was depicted in the code, and then it made also the code more complex. It led to worse code quality. So we analyzed the rule set because we knew that we had to change it because of features that we would have to implement later. And if we were not analyzing and reworking the rule set, we probably would not even have found this issue. But I also want to highlight that even though there were issues, it's a positive example because the business analyst found some issues and potential improvements. After applying these insights, we had cleaner, more maintainable code. And also there were less bugs. We also drastically reduced the number of events that were sent out. I would like to analyze the underlying issues why this code could have gotten so bad in the first place. Therefore, I would like to look at some factors affecting code quality and what we can do about them. Some of these factors will probably also played a role in this example, but I also will look at other factors. Obviously, there was unwanted duplication, and consolidating classes that were almost identical already had a huge impact on the complexity and code quality. As I already described, originally it was decided to purposefully have these duplications because they thought it would be easier, but I think in the long run we saw that it probably made things worse than being easier. In some cases, we, for example, only had the rule when the courier was leaving, but not when the courier was stopping. And then this rule would never fire when they leave the warehouse, when they stop at the warehouse in the evening. And another issue is the complexity. There is a huge list of rules, and it is impossible to keep the overview of what rules override which other rules, which fire, when, and you can imagine it was quite a mess. So the duplication and the complexity could both also stem from the issue that sometimes it is just difficult to still see the big picture in a big system. And I feel like for developers this sometimes might be even the bigger problem, because we tend to lose ourselves maybe in technical detail. In this example, these three things work together like a vicious cycle. And we see that by simplifying the code, removing duplication, the code became easier to maintain, which also led to fewer bugs and better code quality, and it also made it more understandable. So I feel like that these steps really help to break the vicious cycle. Let's talk about potential miscommunication or misunderstandings. Usually, stakeholders and developers don't really speak the same language. And I think the goal is to find out how you can improve the communication, but this is easier said than done. First of all, I think it's important that both sides proactively approach each other. I think one issue is that we also have a lot of assumptions. So, for example, developers have assumptions about how the business side works, because maybe if they don't know all the details, they just assume something, and maybe they don't even realize that they just assume it because they think, oh, it's obvious. But also people that work in the business, maybe they don't know a lot about the technical side, and then they also have other assumptions like, oh, this feature would maybe take a long time, it would be very quickly, and so on. So in general, we often don't know what the other people know. Sometimes it's also like you don't know, also between developers, sometimes you think, oh, they anyways know these, maybe, I don't know, patterns and so on, but maybe they don't know. So in general, I feel like it's always good to ask a lot of questions, give a lot of background and context information, and just to try to reduce the misunderstandings. In the talk, Mastering Visual Communication by Jackie Reed, I also feel like she summarized it very well. She said, what is deployed to production is your developer's misunderstanding. And I found this is very fitting with what I just explained before, that, yeah, if the developer doesn't know what the business wants, then, yeah, you will have this outcome. So in order to improve communication, I can also recommend this podcast I linked here by Jackie Reed. It's Communication Patterns with Jackie Reed. As you see, these are clickable links, so at the end of the talk I will show you a QR code where you can download the slides, and so you can also look at all the links that I put in my talk. Exactly. So another possibility could also be some open value courses I found that are also aimed at better communication. So DevOps for managers, IT development for non-IT people, effective communication for software developers, and maybe there are also other courses out there. So you can certainly learn a lot. And I feel like another great thing is, if possible, as a developer, it's great if you can accompany the users of your application. So I actually, at least at 2 places I worked, had this opportunity. We developed an application that was only for internal use, for people that had to, yeah, for example, manage tank containers or whatever. And we then were able to just go to their office for one day and follow their work. Or we weren't just with one person, we jumped around. We were the few people that used our application to better understand how their work is and what their pain points are, because we just know the application from manually testing it sometimes, but we then see, oh, they make this thing like 8 hours a day, so maybe you realize which pain points are and which things are maybe less important for them. But there could also be misunderstandings between developers, because between humans there could be misunderstandings. I often experience that people explain something to me, and then sometimes I have to double check because they maybe use different words that maybe I would have used, and then I have just to make sure, did they mean what I think they meant? So sometimes it's just a bit confusing. So my recommendation is that you try to stick to the correct terms if you know them. I mean, it's also sometimes easier said than done, but I feel like some terms you know, and then you could maybe concentrate on using them. But it's also okay if sometimes you forget them, because, it's human. But I just think if you try to focus to at least use the words you know, it can already help. One example I often experience that isn't that bad, but I just experienced it a few times, that people mix up commit and push. So they just say, can you commit it so I can look at it? And then I ask, I mean, you meant pushing, right? Because if I only commit it, it doesn't help that you can look at it, because then it's not on GitHub or whatever. So, I mean, usually in the context it was clear what they meant. It's just the example that I heard most often. In the picture here, I also feel like you could avoid the confusion if you maybe, instead of using just the word interface, you would say Java interface or user interface, and then you can also avoid the confusion. And also already mentioned, I also have worked in logistics. There we always had to make sure to differentiate between tank container and Docker container. So it's another example, only container wasn't clear in that domain. In order to have less misunderstandings amongst each other, I also feel like diagrams are very important, and I really like to use diagrams. Complex topics can mostly be easier understood if you see them visually, not only in text. And I personally feel it makes sense to draw a diagram or a simple sketch if there isn't an existing diagram you can look at to understand something. I personally also try to do this often. I like to do this especially if I have some more complex topics I am working on. And I personally like to do it just with pen and paper, but you can also use a tool or a tablet or whatever. I just feel like visualizing it is very helpful. And also a little tip, what I sometimes do if I work remotely and I drew the sketch on paper, I usually just take a picture and send it to a colleague if I want to have feedback or want to talk about my sketch. So this has worked well. And I've also experienced that we were in a Zoom or Slack call where there's the draw feature that sometimes people draw something to explain something. I mean, it's not ideal because you draw with the mouse, but I feel it's still sometimes better than not having anything visual. I also feel when you draw a diagram in order to understand something, this might indicate that this diagram is missing in your documentation. So you probably should add it to the documentation somewhere. And if you think, oh, this diagram is very specific, it's only because of that story that I created this diagram, maybe it makes still sense to add it somewhere and just make sure that you write there, this diagram was created for this specific story and it only contains the things that are relevant for this topic, just that other people are not confused. But you don't know, maybe in 2 years someone has a bug exactly with that and they will be very happy that this diagram exists. And I mean, if you already have the diagram, it's not a lot of effort to then save it somewhere and not just keep it on your computer. And if you are struggling to know where to save what information, there's something else I can recommend, another video from Check You Read. It's knowledge management for the technically inclined. It will be linked in the further resources in the slides, so if this is something that interests you, you can have a look at it. So overall, we saw diagrams can help to understand concepts better. And what I forgot to mention, I also often had the experience that I draw a diagram and then I go there and I talk to colleagues and then I better understand if I didn't understand something correctly, especially when I'm in a new team or in a new project. There are a lot of things you don't know, and then you draw the diagram how you understood it, and then they immediately see, oh, you misunderstood something, there you missed that. And it's often easier to also find things that are missing somewhere when you draw it than if you just say, oh yeah, isn't this service calling this service, and so on. So that's also another use case that I found quite important. So I already mentioned that seeing the big picture is an important aspect to have good code quality. And I feel like reasons why you don't see the big picture could also be too large code bases and too large teams. I mean, most teams, they have a diagram that maybe shows everything, and then as soon as you go down a few layers or want to have some more pictures of only one part of the application, mostly you feel like there aren't a lot of pictures or you don't find a lot of diagrams, because usually only the overall big picture is not really enough to really find issues and so on. So I also feel like that it's necessary to have other pictures, like some intermediate pictures, pictures that show a process and so on. And I think most importantly, you just should try to use the diagram that helps you to show what you want to show. You don't just have to stick, in my eyes, to one specific convention, but try to do the diagram the way it really helps you. Just make sure to also use a legend and say which things mean what. And I feel you can also add some things that are a UML standard in the legend, because sometimes people don't remember anymore, oh, what is this dotted arrow meaning, and so on. So it's also very useful if you just add it in your legend so they don't have to look it up again. And I also want to add, now AI can also sometimes be helpful if it maybe can generate a diagram. There's one skill that I recently was recommended that it's called Visual Explainer, that I also put in the further resources that you maybe can check out. I mean, still you should double check because it's AI. AI can make mistakes, but sometimes it is helpful because you just, yeah, or in a new project there is no diagram for this aspect, and yeah, sometimes it's more quickly that AI, when AI generates that diagram, and in that way AI helps you to understand it, and then you still maybe can code it yourself instead of just pushing everything to AI. So I feel like that's maybe a better use. Yeah, I mean, that's always like personal opinion. So regarding reading diagrams, I can also highly recommend Jack Reed's talk, Mastering Visual Communication for Software Development. That's the same talk where I also mentioned another quote earlier. And there are just a few things I want to highlight from her talk. First of all, different audiences need different levels of detail and different types of diagrams. So it's clear that some diagrams, they are very technical, and it wouldn't make sense that you think, oh, this diagram is for the business people, and so on. And also it is important that if you have different levels of diagrams, do not mix them, because it becomes very confusing if you have a diagram that some things are very detailed and some other things aren't detailed. If you want to show more detail, it's better to then just mark a box and say, oh, here I want to show more detail, and have a different diagram that shows these details. Also consider color blindness, as my father is colorblind, and also I have worked with colorblind colleagues before. It is very important to me. I mean, it is much more prevalent in men, and women are still underrepresented in the IT field, so I feel like the chance is high that the colleague or a future colleague is colorblind. So if you create diagrams, make sure that you use colors that colorblind people can see, or maybe make sure that not only color is the only defining factor. Maybe you can take dotted line and normal line or things like that. And the easiest thing, if you don't have time to check it in a colorblind simulator, just make sure that it's still clear when you check it in grayscale. So then you should be able to cover all or at least most of the bases. And also high-level diagrams, they stay up to date the longest time, so it also makes sense to have them at least. But I also feel like there are often diagrams that are maybe a bit lower level that also stay up to date very long. So I feel like a lot of you maybe also have experienced that too. Who has experienced that knew, oh, this has been developed like this for a long time, but there was never a diagram? Only a few people. I don't know if people are just too tired or you were just lucky. Yeah, good. So I created a very simplified high-level diagram for my example. I mean, as it is a very small example, this big picture is also not that big, but it is very big because I can present in a cinema. So at least there's that. So And then some intermediate big pictures could be how the backend and the mobile frontend or the web frontend work internally, but also other intermediate big pictures are important, like the interactions between different subparts of your application. And this diagram is not enough, as you would not be able to make decisions based on the information given here. And I feel like it is necessary to see the entire process in order to really make decisions. So for my simple example, it made most sense to reuse the diagram that I used to explain the example, only I already removed the updates that were no longer necessary. And this diagram focuses on showing only the process. And as we saw before, already this diagram helped a lot to just find some flaws. And I feel like this helps developers making fewer assumptions, and which means then there are fewer bugs and better structured code. And if we look into only this part, this diagram is much more technical than the previous one. Here we just look at how the update even gets to the person. Maybe I can go back quickly. I only focus on this first event or update and how it then lands in either the web application or the mobile application. And then, yeah, I also made a rather simple diagram that, yeah, GPS detects the moving, the update is sent out, and then the backend receives the update, so the frontend can be updated, but it also updates the database. I mean, this is just a fictional example, so maybe you would do this better. And this is a more technical diagram, but I feel like it's maybe at the level where some people in business would still be able to follow it a bit, but it's not necessary. They would still be able to follow it. But if you then go into more detail, it's definitely only like a technical diagram. Another reason why it is difficult to have the overview of the project is that there are a lot of knowledge silos. So with big projects, the issue is often that for one person it is almost impossible to know enough about the entire project. Most developers only know a certain part of the whole application, or then a little bit about some parts of the application. And then I often also experience that it is easier to split up tasks in the way where, this person always does front-end, so front-end tasks. This person already knows this microservices, so this task, and so on. And so this just reinforces these silos. But I don't think that this is really sustainable, because in my opinion, the link between different responsibilities or modules or microservices is actually one of the most difficult aspects while creating applications. So I feel like it's important that we sometimes also make sure we don't stay in that. Another frequent issue is that knowledge is not shared enough, because when, as I mentioned, you mainly work on certain aspects of the application, it's not astonishing that you cannot see the big picture, because you only know the scope you're working on. And it's also a bit an issue if someone gets sick, someone leaves the company, and so on. So in order to prevent that, it is important to also find some possible solutions. So I feel like it is also important to collaborate more. one possibility is to maybe also sometimes pair programs, so maybe if someone always works on that part and someone else that doesn't know anything about that part could maybe pair with them to learn about that other part of the application. And then maybe you could also try to then switch around and that the other person once maybe takes a story from that part. And I also heard there are bite-sized architecture sessions. So the idea is it's like a brainstorming session, but for architecture. So people come together and then everyone tries to do a diagram of how a specific system looks like. And then you look at it together, and then you can talk about it. You see maybe things that some people misunderstood, and you can in the end make sure that you make the best diagram, because you can take all the ideas and maybe someone forgot that and so on, so you can get a better diagram and you discuss better about how your system is set up. But I feel like there is always the risk that there is knowledge that only lives in the heads of people. But if we just try to eliminate it a bit, we can already make a step in the right direction. In order to better distribute the knowledge and to prevent losing knowledge, it is important to improve documentation. Moreover, people often forget things. So even for the people that were involved in specifying or implementing something, they also might not remember. And also I feel like it is very helpful for new employees. I mean, I still feel like it is important that new employees are onboarded by other people, that people explain them some things. But I feel it's very useful when they also have the possibility to then read again about the topic that someone explained to them, because sometimes it's maybe written in a different way, and I think we know that it's easier to understand something if you have heard it in different ways. So it's good if you have just more resources. Another issue that I encountered is that diagrams or also parts of the documentation are not understandable without an introduction from someone who has been in the team for a longer time. I feel like we are almost used to this, and sometimes we just think it's normal, but maybe we shouldn't think that it's normal. Yeah, it's just something we could think about. So countless times I have experienced that the person that knows something specific is, for example, on holidays, and it is then almost impossible to work on like one story that has to do with that, and it's very annoying. So who of you has experienced something similar? Yeah, few people. Yeah, about 4 or so. It's quite surprising. You are all so lucky or very tired. Good. But therefore, I think that we should try to provide all the necessary information to understand the documentation and diagrams, because there might always be the situation that one person that knows the things left the companies on holidays, is sick, whatever. And yeah, I feel like it's not good if only one person knows it. I mean, of course, there are always aspects that are subject to change, and some level of detail does not make sense to document. But I also am sure that most projects have some basic concepts that have not changed in a long time and never were documented. And I feel like it's maybe a bit exaggerated, but I think it kind of reminds me of the times where people just told them stories, maybe around the fireplace. And then, yeah, some part of the knowledge in some teams seems to be really only told like this, which is romantic until someone goes on vacation. It is also important to document reasons for a specific decision, especially when you do something that isn't the default. I mean, there are different possibilities you can do that. I just think it is important to document it, because I also have experienced that I changed something because it was like it was wrong, and it was on purpose because I broke some things then, but I wasn't aware because it wasn't documented anywhere. So I feel like the art is to find a balance between documenting enough and not too much, and I cannot really quantify what is the correct amount. Yeah, I just feel like it's also important that if you have diagrams where you don't know, if maybe it will change or so, make sure that there are dates. So that's also very helpful to at least know, oh, this is 2 years old, so it might have changed. So I was only able to scratch the surface and mention some things that are important to me, but there are entire talks only about documentation. So you can find much more information about that if you're interested. So coming back to the topic of complexity, there also is some domain complexity that cannot be simplified more. So I feel like then it's just important to also talk to business and look how you can break it down. Just if you make sure that you understand it better, you then also understand better what you maybe can put into smaller methods, so you can at least still make it more understandable and easier to manage, instead of having just one big method or so on. So all in all, complex logic is unavoidable, but if you at least can break it down in understandable parts with the input of business, it becomes safer and easier to maintain. So the first time I gave this talk, another speaker told me that they were surprised that I did not mention domain-driven design, and I totally agree. DDD could be a potential solution to fix some of the issues I mentioned in my talk. So many points I mentioned, like always using the same keywords, are also defined in the domain-driven reference by Eric Evans. So I would like to quickly show you the 3-point summary of DDD. So first, it is important to focus on the core domain. He defined the core domain as the domain that makes the money for the customer. So usually the things that are not just generic or almost the same in every company are the topics or the aspects where you profit the most from DDD. The second point touches on topics I already talked about. So communicating between development and business. And third point, speak a ubiquitous language within an explicitly bounded context. So with bounded context, DDD means that in a specific context there are certain rules and certain keywords, so you should maybe try to stick to them. And speaking a ubiquitous language is important. And I struggled with the word ubiquitous because it's also not my first language. So in this context, the closest synonym would be universal. So he recommends using a universal language in a specific context. So just always use the same word for one specific thing in your domain. So I also feel like if you do not work with DDD, I think you can still try to incorporate some concepts to improve the understanding from the developer side and the stakeholder side. Especially the collaboration between business and developers, I feel like is very important. And this is of course, there's much more that DDD encompasses. You can look into the DDD reference, and I also, I think, put some more in the further resources. And there are even entire DDD conferences, so there's a lot of information if you are interested. So I still want to highlight, you should not forget that there are still some things that stay in the developer's responsibility. Like static code analysis, doing good code reviews, sticking to guidelines, and so on. I mean, it is beyond the scope of this talk, but I just wanted to remind you that you should not ignore these aspects and just think, yeah, everything is because of the communication between development and business. So I am concluding my talk. We often talk about code quality like it lives in the IDE, but in reality it starts in conversations long before the first line of code is written. Everyone has a role to play in code quality, and it is a shared responsibility. And you just should try to continuously work on improving the communication. And I think one good place to start is just to recognize when you have assumptions about the knowledge of orders and so on. And if you're not already doing it, if you are explaining something or trying to understand something, maybe just draw a quick sketch. That's another easy way where you can start. And I feel like these tips can also be used by developers, but also if you're a non-technical person. And I feel like there is no perfect solution, but we can just try to incorporate ways to improve the current situation. So, as I promised, there is the link with my slides. Yeah, I have a little bit time for questions. Are there questions? There's one. What do you do when you don't know where to document something you notice is missing? So if I don't know, I mean, first of all, I maybe just ask and say, hey, this is missing. Where does it make sense to put it? I mean, sometimes you have like an idea where it could make sense. Maybe sometimes it also makes sense to just put it somewhere, but in my experience, the conference search is quite bad. So if the search was better, I would say you don't have to care as much where you put it. And also I mentioned the first, I think it's the first link that I put in the further resources. Jackie Reed talks about that. I think it is, yes. I think it's in knowledge management for the technically inclined. I recommend that you look at that. There she talks about this. So you probably know that you were also heard maybe yesterday that you can rate my talk on Slido, and as we don't have enough QR codes, there's also a QR code to give me feedback. Yeah, I mean, you can also find it just on the webpage where my talk is there, or the rate my talk and feedback QR code. Yes, and also if you have more questions that maybe you thought, oh, these are too specific questions, I don't want to ask them in this big room. I'm still here the entire day, so if you see me anywhere, don't be afraid, I don't bite. Just approach me and ask me questions. I'm also from Switzerland. I also have Swiss chocolate, so you don't only get an answer to your question, you could also get Swiss chocolate. Yes, that's it. And also feel free if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn or anywhere. I'm Annelore Dev almost everywhere. Yes, I guess that's it. And enjoy the rest of the conference.